If Iran wanted a nuclear weapon, Iran would have had it a long time ago. Iran is today, thanks to Trump, one of the 10 most advanced countries in nuclear energy, one of the 10 most advanced countries in the world. So Iran could develop a nuclear weapon whenever it wants. And we know how Iranian drone and missile technology, how advanced that is, and how developed Iran is in that regard. It's very simple for Iran. The point is that the Iranians never wanted a nuclear weapon because the nuclear weapons are are horrible for the world. And not only would they cause instability because then other countries would want them, but also Iran just doesn't like these sort of weapons. I think it's very difficult for some people in the West to comprehend that the Islamic Republic of Iran is much more humane than Western regimes. And let me give you an example. During the 1980s, when the West was giving Saddam Hussein chemical weapons to use against Iran, and I survived two chemical attacks, one mustard gas attack in 1988 and one nerve agent in 1984 during the Khaybar operation. The Iranian commanders and leaders went to the leader back then and said we should develop chemical weapons, just like Saddam Hussein. And he said no. He said no, we are not going to develop and use chemical weapons. So Iran paid a price. And Western countries not only gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons, they banned Iran, they prevented other countries from selling Iran gas masks. They prevented Iran from obtaining the materials to defend themselves from chemical weapons. That is how Western regimes behave. And that's how Iran behaved. And today, those same regimes are supporting genocide in Gaza, and Iran is the lone country, alongside Yemen, of course, that is standing against the genocide. But what is interesting is that in the West, when they speak about Iran and they speak about the divisions in Iran, in the West, when they speak about divisions, they say, "Oh, this is open society. There's debate. There are checks and balances." But when it's Iran, it's division. The country is falling apart. The people are against each other. So the same thing in the West is presented in a positive way, but in Iran is presented in a very negative way. The fact is that in Iran, there's much more freedom. And, again, many of your viewers will be skeptical, I have no doubt. But in many ways, there's much more freedom in Iran than in the West. Which mainstream media outlet in the West has been saying anything against the Israeli regime in a significant way over the last 16 months, or against the war in Ukraine? The mainstream media, the legacy media, they've been all supporting these wars. In Iran, when Syria fell, there are telegram channels, newspapers, websites, and political parties and entities that welcome the fall of President Assad. They're completely opposed to the government, the state policy on Syria. Many of these people oppose the resistance. Many of them said it's great that Assad fell, and that this is just the same narrative as the West. The very same narrative that you see on CNN or on the BBC. They're repeated by these liberals who have websites and who have very powerful media in the country. But you don't see that in the West. You only see it in alternative media. But these are very mainstream media. So all of these people, all of these governments have been exposed, and people across the region will be more demanding of their governments in the future. This region is not very stable. We have to remember what happened in Tunisia. Some young man in a decade and a half ago protested, set himself alight on the streets in protest, and the government in Egypt collapsed, let alone the government in Tunisia. So anything can happen in this region, and the more the Europeans and the Americans push for death and slaughter, the more chance there is that regimes in the Western camp can be destabilized, especially now that you have these terrorists in power in Syria. They could also be a factor in creating instability. So these Western regimes should be very careful for what they wish for. So I don't think that the regime will last very long. And the fact is that the United States and the Europeans that have been the real reason why the regime exists, they are on the decline, on the relative decline. Europe is declining much faster than the United States. And the rest of the world, which is very much outraged by these atrocities, they're on the rise. So the Israeli regime, as we've seen over the past 16 months, is completely dependent on the United States and the West. It's not an independent regime. The West has to send weapons 24 hours a day to help it slaughter women and children. Yet it still was unable to win. So the regime has declined. The West is in decline, relative decline. This is not going to end well. And also our regime, our region has regimes that are in the Western camp that are very vulnerable. People in this region see forget, Iran and the axis of resistance aside, people across the region know that their governments have done nothing but help the Israeli regime. Even those who pretend to be pro-Palestinian, like Erdogan, who every now and then makes a speech or has a demonstration, holds a demonstration against Israel, he's doing all sorts. He's fueling the genocide. It's the oil that he sends to Israel that helps with it. Even after Netanyahu was declared a war criminal and an arrest warrant was given, he continued to do business with it. Well, the Iranian nuclear program, the peaceful nuclear program, is very well protected because the United States is a lawless regime, because the Europeans are lawless regimes. They've constantly threatened Iran with military strikes over the years. All options are on the table. The West can threaten countries whenever they like, because for them, international law means nothing. For them, the international law is for the others. It's for the non-Western governments. They have to abide by commitments. They have to abide by the international law. The nuclear deal with Iran was a good example. Obama, from day one, began to violate the deal, but the Iranians were forced to abide by their commitments. Of course, in future, that's not going to happen. Iran won't accept that sort of deal. But the point is that the West sees itself as above the law. They see themselves as exceptional. American exceptionalism is basically that very same thing. They see themselves as having more rights than others, more privileges than others. And that's why the Iranians have been forced to protect their nuclear program and build it very, very deep underground, so that if the Americans or the Israelis or anyone else tries to bomb it, they will fail to destroy it. So that, and of course, Iran has extensive air defenses around it too. So and as you pointed out, that not only have the Americans used chemical weapons, but the Israeli regime is a genocidal regime. And this genocidal regime has already had senior government officials threaten and people with nuclear weapons. We saw a minister in the Israeli cabinet speak about using a nuclear weapon in Gaza at the beginning of the genocide. And on numerous occasions, Netanyahu, this genocidal monster, went to where they have their nuclear program and made threats against Iran from there, basically implying that the Israeli regime can use nuclear weapons. So whenever Westerners try to, Western elites and think tanks and media, when they talk about human rights in Iran, I always find it ridiculous, because I've survived chemical attacks. I couldn't breathe because of chemical attacks. I lived through chemical attacks. I'll never believe any Western media outlet that pretends that they care about human dignity and human rights. So when the Iranians say that they don't want nuclear weapons because it is immoral and it kills innocent people, they're very serious, and history has shown that they're consistent. However, the Iranians have said that if there's an existential threat to the country, then they will change their nuclear posture. They've been very explicit about that, which is understandable. So that's not where Iran wants to go. And the Americans, if they're foolish enough, then Iran will be forced to change its position. So I think Iran is in a position, it's being very smart. They have the capability, and that itself is deterrence. It's a threshold state, but they don't want the bomb. And as I said, if they wanted it, they would have had it a long time ago. And there's nothing that the Americans could have done about it. And there's nothing they can do about it today. And that, I think, the smartest thing is to do one's best to prevent nuclear war, because that would bring about the end of humanity. If there's a nuclear exchange anywhere in this world, that will have huge consequences. And of course, if it's between the Americans and the Chinese and the Russians, that would bring an end to everything. But a nuclear war, whether between India and Pakistan or in our region, that will have consequences for the entire globe that will be irreversible. If Iran wanted a nuclear weapon, Iran would have had it a long time ago. Iran is today, thanks to Trump, one of the 10 most advanced countries in nuclear energy, one of the 10 most advanced countries in the world. So Iran could develop a nuclear weapon whenever it wants. And we know how Iranian drone and missile technology, how advanced that is, and how developed Iran is in that regard. It's very simple for Iran. The point is that the Iranians never wanted a nuclear weapon because nuclear weapons are horrible for the world. And not only would they cause instability because then other countries would want them, but also Iran just doesn't like these sort of weapons. I think it's very difficult for some people in the West to comprehend that the Islamic Republic of Iran is much more humane than Western regimes. And let me give you an example. During the 1980s, when the West was giving Saddam Hussein chemical weapons to use against Iran, and I survived two chemical attacks, one mustard gas attack in 1988 and one nerve agent in 1984 during the Khaybar operation. The Iranian commanders and leaders went to the leader back then and said we should develop chemical weapons, just like Saddam Hussein. And he said no. He said no, we are not going to develop and use chemical weapons. So Iran paid a price. And Western countries not only gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons, they banned Iran. They prevented other countries from selling Iran gas masks. They prevented Iran from obtaining the materials to defend themselves from chemical weapons. That is Western. That is how Western regimes behave. And that's how Iran behaved. And today, those same regimes are supporting genocide in Gaza. And Iran is the lone country, alongside Yemen, of course, that is standing against the genocide. So if there are negotiations at some point, and right now the Iranians are being very tough. You can see, as you rightly pointed out, what the interview that the foreign minister made shows that the Iranians are not going to be giving any unnecessary concessions to anyone. So at this stage, I think that nothing is really happening between Iran and the United States. If at some point the Americans decide to be sane and put a very reasonable offer to the Iranians, then it's possible that there will be negotiations. But as I said, that has nothing to do with the axis of resistance, just as it never had anything to do with the axis of resistance in the past. Well, if we go back to 2015 during the nuclear negotiations, even though I believe that the nuclear deal was pretty flawed and that it could have been better negotiated, and that the Rouhani administration put the negotiators in a very bad position for a host of reasons, which I don't want to get into right now. But even back then, when Iran was weaker than today and the United States was stronger, the United States and Iran, when they signed the deal, it had nothing to do with Iran, the axis of resistance. Iran's support for Hezbollah had nothing to do with the deal. Iran's support for the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq had nothing to do with the nuclear deal. Iran's support for Ansarullah, or what the West likes to call the Houthis in Yemen and the Yemeni government, was not a part of any deal. So even if at some point the Iranians do negotiate with the Americans, that has nothing to do with Iran's support for the axis of resistance. And without a doubt, the Israelis would like to see a war. They would be more than willing to sacrifice the United States or the Europeans or the global economy for their own selfish interest. They never cared about the West. They've destroyed the image and the credibility of the West by carrying out this Holocaust for the last 15, 16 months. The West has paid the price in the sense that they have no credibility across the world. The world sees the West as barbaric and inhumane, the Western elites and the regimes that are in power. So Israel, is more than willing to sacrifice everything. So it gave large numbers of martyrs among civilians and among supporters of the resistance and among the resistance itself for the sake of another people, for the sake of the people of Palestine, for the people of Gaza in particular. And in addition to that, Ansarullah, they did the same. They made sacrifices. They were constantly being bombed by the Americans and their sidekick in London, and also the Israelis, because they were implementing the Genocide Convention in the Red Sea, blocking ships from going to Israeli ports. And this is the same Ansarullah that survived 7 years of genocide itself, a genocide where the Saudis and the Emiratis, with the support of Qatar, with the support of Turkey, all of these countries were supporting the genocide in Yemen, along with NATO countries. They were all behind. Ansarullah was very much alone. Only later on, when there was a split between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and we saw that the Saudis and the Emiratis besiege Qatar, Turkey and Qatar move away from Saudi Arabia. But so Yemen, which had survived 7 years of genocide, they were willing to make even more sacrifices for the sake of the people of Gaza. So he gave them special thanks alongside the resistance in Iraq and, of course, the Islamic Republic of Iran. But he also thanked Jordanian citizens who went into, on their own, at their own initiative, not the government had nothing to do with it, into the West Bank and carried out operations against the Israeli regime, and they were all killed and they were all martyred, fighting. There were, I think, 2 or 3 attacks, if I'm not mistaken. Your viewers could correct me if I'm wrong. So if there is a revival, there's no doubt that as we speak, the Iranians continue to support Gaza. They will get new supplies. It's been going on throughout this period through the means that they have, which I have no idea how it works. And the same is happening in Lebanon. The same is happening in Yemen. They're all preparing themselves for the next phase. But it's going to be very costly for the regime if it revives this war. Again, the biggest, as I said, all the areas that they've withdrawn from in Gaza, the resistance is preparing those territories for the future. So if they want to fight again, they'll have to retake all those territories. And but alongside that, the international community is going to be disgusted because they're saying, well, this is over now. Why are you seeking further trouble? They're releasing your prisoners, and it was very interesting, very smart move by the resistance to have these women, most of these women, wear their uniforms to remind the world that these weren't just a bunch of teenagers or young women that were taken. These were soldiers of the Israeli armed forces. So I think this has been a major defeat for Israel. The last 16 months, been almost 16 months now, have been disastrous. And the most important element of all is that the regime has been delegitimized in the eyes of the global majority. Even in the West, even in the United States, you see people like Tucker Carlson saying things that were not said before, or Candace Owens. These are people on the right, and among other groups in American civil society, we see huge opposition toward Zionism and the regime itself. And therefore, I think that is the most devastating aspect of this conflict, the fact that they have not just the Israeli regime, but the collective West. It has destroyed its image across the world because they've been partner to this genocide. The only thing that was unexpected was Syria. And Syria, as I said from the very beginning, was a tactical victory for Netanyahu, Erdogan, Erdogan and Biden. But I think in the long run, actually, Syria is not going to end well for any of these actors because Al Qaeda in Syria is not going to be able to control the country. We're already seeing it's the slaughter of people who they feel are a threat. We see that they're incapable of governing, and we also see that countries across the region and across Asia are wary, very wary of Al Qaeda. Countries that like China, Russia, Central Asian countries where many of these fighters come from, they're concerned and they're concerned about what Mr. Erdogan is doing. And even countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan are concerned. Jolani is trying to strengthen relations with the Saudis, but the Saudis are worried because these extremists in Syria have ambitions that go beyond the borders of Syria, and many of them are far more extreme than Jolani, or at least today, Jolani today. Otherwise, Jolani was the deputy of ISIS. He was Abu Baghdadi's deputy. He killed thousands of people in car bombs across Iraq. But the Jolani today, uh, he is going to have a very tough time dealing with the more extreme elements that have taken Damascus. And that, as I said, is a threat to the West because the countries that are threatened by these extremist groups are in the Western camp. But this time around in Gaza, they were stuck. And in Lebanon, we saw the most heavy fighting ever between the Israeli regime and the power outside of its borders. The battle in southern Lebanon on the border was very heavy. The fighting was extraordinarily heavy, but Hezbollah held its ground, and the Israeli regime was unable to take a single city, even a small city or a large town. It failed completely. And while many were martyred in Gaza and in Lebanon, and civilians were slaughtered, and resistance fighters on both to the south and the north were martyred, but the Israelis failed. And we also saw in the Red Sea for over 15 months, the Americans tried to crush the resistance there too, so that the Israelis could use the Red Sea to strengthen their economy, to carry out the genocide more easily. They failed. They failed across the board. This was all expected. I've been saying that the Israeli regime will fail in Gaza and in Lebanon and in the Red Sea from the very beginning. The Israelis were bound to be defeated in Gaza, despite the horrific massacres and the genocide, the Holocaust. The Palestinians were determined from day one that they will hold their ground. And Hamas and its allies showed the Israelis that they are not the power that they were before. In the decades before the rise of the axis of resistance, whenever the Israelis wanted to invade a neighboring country, whether Lebanon or Syria or Jordan or Egypt, they would advance swiftly and take large amounts of land. They went all the way to Beirut, they took the West Bank, they took the Golan, and of course they went all the way across the Sinai very easily and very swiftly.